The night after the attack, James sat in the dim light of his study, a half-empty glass of water on the desk, untouched and forgotten. His bruised ribs throbbed with every breath, but it was the pounding in his head that consumed him. He ran a tired hand over his face, the sting of a cut on his cheek reminding him of the wooden stick that had barely missed breaking his jaw. Who would go to such lengths? The question twisted in his mind like a blade. He wasn't just any officer, he was James Carter, known for being relentless in his duties. But not everyone appreciated his dedication. The list of enemies that flickered through his mind narrowed as he thought more carefully. Memories of the shouting match at the small cafe came unbidden. It was an ordinary afternoon when James, passing by, had overheard the conversation that set the course of his marriage ablaze. His future father-in-law, Mr. Mitchell, had been laughing with a friend, casually belittling James's family, branding them as beneath his status. The rage had bubbled up so quickly that James had confronted him right there, the entire cafe watching with bated breath. "I will not stand by while you insult my family," he had shouted, chest heaving with indignation. The older man's face had gone red, not just from anger but from the humiliation of being called out publicly. The wedding had been cancelled that night, pride wounded beyond repair. But love had its own will. James's fiancée, Emma, showed up at his house that night, tear-streaked and defiant. "I'm not a pawn for him to push around, James. We'll do this on our own terms," she had said, and they did. A quick marriage at the registry office the next day sealed their fate, and a son followed years later, but the rift with Mr. Mitchell never healed. Would he now, after so many years, send men to harm his daughter's husband? James tapped his fingers on the desk, the doubt in his mind thickening. Mr. Mitchell was proud and bitter, but killing? That seemed too far, even for him. James leaned back, the chair creaking under the strain. He thought of Inspector Harris, his senior by a few years. Harris had always worn his uniform with an air of superiority until James, younger but hard-working, outpaced him for a promotion. The congratulatory handshake Harris offered that day had been cold, his smile brittle. The tension between them grew over time, especially after an argument in the office a few weeks back. "Don't ever raise your voice to me, Carter," Harris had barked, his fists clenching at his sides. James, under pressure from a high-profile case, had snapped back, "Respect is earned, not demanded." The room had gone silent, colleagues exchanging nervous glances. Later, Harris's warning had echoed in James's mind. "You'll regret this one day." But even Harris, with his simmering resentment, seemed unlikely to mastermind an ambush involving 4 hired thugs. He preferred a different kind of warfare, whispered rumors, sidelong glances, making life difficult but not deadly. James rubbed his temples and shifted his gaze out the window, where the faint silhouette of his neighbor's house loomed. Mr. Collins, a sullen man in his 50s, had always kept to himself. His parents, frail and in need of attention, had often sat on their porch, eyes dull with loneliness. James's heart ached the day he noticed them and brought over his young son, whose giggles lit up their evening like a ray of sun breaking through the clouds. It became a daily ritual, his son visiting the old couple, bringing joy where there had been silence. He and Emma sometimes shared tea with them, talking of simple things. When the couple passed away, James had been shocked to learn they had left him their small farm. It was a gesture of gratitude, a testament to kindness. But to Collins, it was a betrayal. The will, written in James's favor, drove a wedge of resentment so deep that the once polite nods at the gate turned into narrowed glares and muttered curses. But could that bitterness compel Collins to orchestrate violence? James struggled with the idea, picturing the man's rigid posture and the barely concealed scorn in his eyes during their last meeting. Each name on the list carried its own shadow of suspicion. But as the night wore on and the first hints of dawn cast a pale light across the room, James knew he needed to dig deeper, to find the thread that tied this mystery together. James stood outside the modest, weathered house, heart pounding with both anticipation and doubt. The early morning air was cool, carrying the scent of dew and wet leaves. A faint light glowed from inside, illuminating the worn curtains that failed to hide the shadowy figure moving within. He clenched his jaw, every muscle tense, replaying the scene from the night before, the ambush, the rush of pain, the shock on his wife's face when he finally limped home. This had to end, and it had to end now. Without knocking, James pushed the wooden door open. It creaked, announcing his presence as he stepped inside. The living room was simple, cluttered with a lifetime of belongings. Old family photos lined the walls, a testament to better days. There, sitting hunched over on a wooden chair, was Mark, the man James had arrested just days before. Mark looked up, eyes hollow and dark-circled, a man eroded by sleepless nights and worry. "Mark!" James barked, striding forward and gripping the man's wrist. The sudden movement sent a glass of water toppling from the table, shattering on the floor. Mark flinched but did not resist. He looked down at James's hand, then back up at his face, eyes pooling with something more complex than just fear or defiance. "Inspector," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of resignation. "What do you want at this hour? You sent them last night, didn't you?" James's voice was low, rough from exhaustion and anger. "The men who attacked me on the road." "But why?" His grip tightened, muscles coiled with restrained force. Mark's eyes, weary and red-rimmed, met James's. He let out a sigh, shoulders slumping as if the weight of his secret had grown too heavy to bear. "I didn't mean to kill you," he whispered, each word carefully chosen and regret-laden. "I wanted you to feel what it's like to see fear in your loved one's eyes, just like my daughter did." The silence that followed was suffocating. James felt as though the floor had fallen away beneath him, leaving him suspended in a moment of harsh realization. He released Mark's wrist, the urgency draining from his body as he took a step back. Memories of that night when he stormed into Mark's house, shouting, arresting him while his young daughter woke, terrified, surfaced like echoes of a bad dream. He remembered her wide, tear-filled eyes, peering out from behind her mother's legs. James's voice softened, tinged with a guilt that clawed at him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words a quiet acknowledgement of a line crossed. "I didn't realize the impact of that night." Mark's eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and relief. His shoulders loosened, and he rubbed his wrist where James had gripped him. "Apology accepted," Mark said, a small, weary nod punctuating his words. "Let's move past this. I won't carry this hatred forward, and I hope you don't carry guilt." James swallowed, feeling the tightness in his chest ease just slightly. The tension in the room melted away, replaced by a fragile understanding. Sunlight streamed in through the cracks in the curtains, casting long shadows that danced across the worn floorboards. They stood there for a moment, two men on opposite sides of duty and consequence, both scarred by the events of that night but no longer bound by them. James turned to leave, the faint sound of a child stirring in the back room tugging at his heart. It reminded him of his own son, waiting for him at home. He paused at the door, offering a final glance over his shoulder. "Mark, take care of her," he said, voice tinged with sincerity. "I will," Mark replied, eyes softening for the first time since the arrest. James stepped out into the morning light, a sense of closure following him like a shadow, lightening with each step. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting the city in hues of soft gold and pale lavender. The streets, still cloaked in the remnants of night, were eerily quiet as James hurried down the narrow lane that led to Mark's house. His breath came in sharp, labored bursts, each step echoing with urgency. The attack had left him battered, but it was the realization that kept him awake all night, gnawing at him until he could no longer ignore it. The door to Mark's house stood ajar, a thin stream of light spilling out onto the cracked front step. James pushed it open further, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside of the house was dim and still. The faint scent of incense lingered, mixing with the sharper tang of dried tears and sleepless nights. Mark sat slumped in a chair, eyes unfocused, staring at nothing in particular. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. "Mark," James called, his voice cutting through the quiet. The man looked up slowly, eyes dull but searching. James's silhouette filled the doorway, casting a long shadow across the worn rug that separated them. "You sent them last night, didn't you?" James's voice was hoarse, more a statement than a question. He stepped closer, every inch of him prepared for confrontation. "Why?" Mark's face tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening as if bracing for another blow. He met James's gaze, and for the first time, the anger and sorrow were laid bare. "Yes," he admitted, the word heavy and final. He didn't flinch or deny, instead, he looked down at his hands, fingers twisting nervously in his lap. "But I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted you to feel it. The fear. The helplessness." The room seemed to shrink around James, the walls pressing in with the weight of those words. The scene from that fateful night flashed in his mind, him shouting orders, Mark's daughter waking in terror, her small face crumpled with confusion and fright. His pulse slowed as understanding seeped in, replacing the adrenaline-fueled rage with a dull ache of guilt. "I didn't know," James said, his voice quieter now, stripped of authority. "I didn't know what that moment did to you, to your family." The grip on his anger loosened, the raw edge of resentment dulling as he took another step forward. "I'm sorry, Mark. Truly." Mark's eyes softened, the hardness melting away as his shoulders sagged with a mix of exhaustion and relief. The lines on his face, carved by worry and sleepless nights, seemed to ease just a little. He met James's eyes and nodded, a hesitant gesture that spoke of wounds acknowledged and, perhaps, the first steps toward healing. "Apology accepted," Mark said, the words barely more than a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, the tension visibly draining from him. "I couldn't bear to see that fear in her eyes again. I had to make you understand." James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The knot in his chest began to unwind, a feeling of lightness, unfamiliar but welcome, replacing it. The room, once thick with accusation, seemed to brighten with the first rays of morning sun creeping through the window. A faint stir came from the back room, the quiet rustle of a child waking. It tugged at James's heart, reminding him of his own son waiting at home, and the love he had fought for night after night. He took a final look at Mark, a man who had suffered in silence until his grief had become a weapon. "Take care of her, Mark," James said, sincerity threading through each word. The weight of guilt shifted, making room for hope and understanding. Mark's expression softened into something that almost resembled a smile, small and tentative. "I will," he said, the simple promise a bridge over the chasm that had divided them. James turned, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The world seemed a little clearer, the path ahead no longer clouded by anger or uncertainty. The rising sun cast a warm light across the city, and for the first time in days, James felt the tightness in his chest give way to the gentle comfort of peace.